Thank you, Christina. It's so nice to be here this evening, to see so many friends and family members. That's pretty much the entire congregation, except some of my golfing buddies, which I've never been able to say in a speaking capacity before. And so it's great to see my golfing buddies. I love to be in this building. This has great significance to me personally. I, like Elder Holland, attended here as a teenager while our chapel was being built, which was the East Stake Center, then being 2 stakes in St. George. So my time as a teacher and as a priest in the Aaronic priesthood of the church was spent in this building. And I just love this. My friend Doug Bringhurst, who's here tonight, we would sit where you're seated and count the grape bunches around the ceiling there. And I think Elder Holland counted the window panes, if I remember correctly, from one of his talks. I don't remember the exact number of the grapes, but there's a lot of them. And it's just a special building, and I've been so pleased that the church has kept it in such great condition through the years. And having spent several $1 million in a renovation just a few years ago, I know it came over our desk when I was working in church history, and the proposal was to replace the roof for $80,000. And like any remodel, as you start into it, you see other things that need to be done. And I believe the final figure was like 6-point-something million. So I'm just really grateful that we have a church that values this building as much as they do, and certainly is beloved by all of us, regardless of our faith and our religious affiliation. Many in this valley love this building greatly. Plus, it was the construction of this building was actually a public works project, so to speak. Had it not been for the construction of the tabernacle and sometime later the temple, it would have been very difficult for the early settlers to have stayed here, just simply because of the poverty and difficulty here to make and sustain a living. So by working on these buildings, the temple and the tabernacle, they could receive tithing script to purchase needed commodities for them and their families. So really came at a very wonderful time for those who were called to come down here. It was difficult to get everyone to stay, as you can imagine, especially if they came sometime during the summer months. They kept going back to Salt Lake, unwilling to make the commitment to stay here in southern Utah. And my great-great-grandfather, Erastus Snow, kept looking for others to come down. Finally, Brigham Young said of him that he keeps looking for people that would sit on a hot rock and stay there forever until they were told to move. That's who he's looking for to come. And so I'm glad that we could, well, we don't really understand, I guess, in this generation what it must have been like back then. But I'm grateful for the temple and the tabernacle for helping them make a go of it in those very early years. The subject I've been asked to speak to is studying the past to effect a better future. Now, I'm really grateful, as well as Christina, that this conference at Utah Tech is named after Juanita Brooks, but I can assure you she would have been greatly embarrassed by the attention. But I would really like to begin by addressing her life. And I have just been delighted in reading some of her books again, namely Reviewing Mountain Meadow Massacre, of course, and Quicksand and Cactus, and then reading the biography of Levi Peterson, which was an award-winning book written about Juanita. Juanita Leon Levitt was born on January 15th, 1898, in the small village of Bunkerville, Nevada, which is some 30 miles away from here to the south. If you think Bunkerville is remote now, Imagine what it must have been like in 1898. It's really difficult to imagine a more remote place. During her growing up years, a trip to St. George was considered a long journey to a big city. Bear in mind that the 1900 census of St. George was 1,690 souls, so it wasn't much of a big city. At the time of her birth, Bunkerville was part of a larger regional area known as Dixie, and the town of St. George was and still is considered the center community of Dixie. Most of her life would be spent in this region, with the exception of some time in Salt Lake working for the Utah Historical Society, and also during her time back east at Columbia University, where she received a master's degree. So during most of her time, she would live in a town that had a population of less than 5,000 people. And only during her later years, most of whom she was ill, did St. George really begin to grow, topping out at 28,000 at the time of her passing in 1989. Now, as a young boy and as a young man, I knew Juanita Brooks, as some of you did here tonight. To me, she was Sister Brooks, a quiet but bright woman who taught school at Dixie College and who wrote books. I was better acquainted with her and her husband's children, with her and Will's children. Carl was an exceptionally good friend, and Willa worked for us at our law firm for a few years as a receptionist and took better care of us than her own mothers. Carl has just been a great friend. I want to just tell one thing about Carl before I move on. We have one of our four sons is Navajo, coming to us initially on the Indian Placement Service that some of you will remember. And then when he was an adult, we adopted him. But while he was with us in high school, he was pulled over by the local police department for some minor traffic violation. They had him in handcuffs, leaning over the back of his hood of his pickup when Carl drove by. He screeched to a stop, jumped out of his truck, said, "Take the handcuffs off that boy." And do you know who this is? He said, "This is Clue Snow." And I've always been grateful for Carl and the way he just did things. He was great. Walt, Will's oldest son, he was Juanita's stepson, was my high school football coach, and as a young man, no one outside my own family had a greater influence on me than Coach Brooks. I do not believe Juanita knew me well, but I'm sure she quite certainly knew that I was Greg's son and that I was Eric Snow's grandson. And that's the way it was back in small towns. Everyone knew in some way everyone else. Her childhood in Bunkerville was to her idyllic. The nice thing about living in a small village where everyone is poor is that you really don't know you are poor. Her father was Henry Levitt, known to the locals as Hen. Her paternal grandfather was Dudley Levitt, an early associate of Jacob Hamlin, and one of the original members called to the Southern Utah Indian Mission. Her mother was Mary Hafen, a granddaughter of John Hafen from Santa Clara, who had sent one of his plural wives and her children to make do in the desert community of Bunkerville. She was really a tomboy growing up. But she enjoyed her rural life immensely. She writes of these childhood experiences in Quicksand and Cactus, which is a compilation of autobiographical vignettes covering her life up to the time of her marriage to Will Brooks in 1933. In later years, she was proud to recall that many of the locals referred to her as Hen's boy, Hen Levitt's boy, because of her tomboy ways. In this book, we learn of one of the great tragedies of her life when she was widowed after only 2 years of marriage to Ernest Pulsifer, a young man who also lived along the river in southern Nevada. She would have one son, Ernest Jr., from that union, and would remain a widow for some 12 years before marrying Will Brooks in 1933. In 1902, her dad, Hen, would leave for a mission, leaving 3 children at home, and shortly after her dad left for his mission, and the 4th child was born. That was in the fall of 1902, and he returned in the, 1902, and he returned in early 1905. Hard to imagine in today's world that the church would send a father and a husband away for a 3-year mission or 2.5-year mission on his own, but that's what happened with Henry Leavitt. Now, Bunkerville at the time of its founding was a distant outpost was really included as part of the Utah Territory. It was many days, even weeks of travel to reach church headquarters from Bunkerville, Nevada, to reach headquarters in Salt Lake City. As a result, and because of this time in history, many families did not live the revelation, such as the word of wisdom, with any degree of preciseness. The Leavitt family was no exception to this. While there was not the use of tobacco in the home, they were comfortable with drinking tea and coffee, and they devoured their homemade fermented grapes along with their homemade wine. In his excellent biography of Juanita Brooks, Levi Peterson records an interesting and amusing anecdote related to the word of wisdom adherence in Bunkerville. Quote, Mary Ann Hafen, Juanita's maternal grandmother, devoutly conveyed to the bishop an exact amount of butter, eggs, and fruit from her lot and field. She also made excellent wine, convinced that because it was of her own manufacture, drinking it was not against the word of wisdom. One day when Juanita, helping with her grandmother with her wash, complained of a stomach ache, Grandma Hafen relieved her with a little sugared wine. I was so strengthened, Juanita wrote. I was drunk. And I said, oh, when I get to be old and a drunkard, I'll tell everybody that I had my first taste of wine from my little Swiss grandmother. And I cried and went to my father, and he set me up and he said, now look, there's some that can't take it, and there's some that can, and you're one that can't. When you get in places where they have it, don't make a scene or preach a sermon, but don't drink any of the wine. Close quote. Quicksand and Cactus goes on to contain many wonderful descriptions by Juanita of what life was like growing up in Bunkerville in the early 20th century. She had many chores, both in the house and around the farm. She enjoyed working with the horses, irrigating, driving the cows to and from different pastures, namely anything that had to do with being outside. She enjoyed pleasing her father, and the highlight of her young life was when he gave her a dappled gray pony named Seela. Unable to attend school one year because of poor health, she and her pony were inseparable, exploring the river bottoms and the desert hills near their home. She also educates us on about worship services and how most all social and cultural activities were under the umbrella of the LDS Church. She describes the many aunts in the community, A-U-N-T-S. I'm sure there were many A-N-T-S's as well. But they were in reality plural wives from the days of polygamy. She describes her first 2-day trip by horse-drawn wagon to St. George to attend the fair and stake conference. She describes seeing the first automobile to visit Bunkerville, and years later tells of her father attempting to stop his first automobile by saying, "Whoa." These vignettes and many others are a rich description of life in a small outlying Mormon village in the opening years of the 20th century. She discovered an early interest in church and pioneer history, particularly from her beloved Dixie. As a young girl, she came across a handwritten history of Sarah Studevant Leavitt, written in her own hand. This is one of her ancestors. She was fascinated with the document and sat reading it for hours, putting her behind with her chores. Collecting pioneer histories, diaries, and journals became a passion, which for a time became a vocation during the Depression, when she was hired by various work programs of the government to do that. She was not a trained historian, as she had acquired a normal education to teach in Nevada 2 years after high school. She obtained a BS in foods and nutrition from BYU and a Master's of Arts degree in English from Columbia University. Her research and efforts to preserve important primary documents led to her desire to write. Initially, she planned to do a book about Jacob Hamlin, but her father said that everyone's writing about Jacob Hamlin. Why don't you write about Dudley Leavitt, her grandfather? And that book was published, it was her first book, and was published in 1942. At the same time, she was writing magazine articles and submitting them for publication, and occasionally was successful. The next years after the book on Dudley Leavitt were spent primarily on a book about the Mountain Meadows Massacre. This would become her definitive work. It was published in 1950 to mostly positive acclaim. It was, however, jarring to the LDS church leadership and to many members of the church. Others more acquainted with the facts surrounding the 1857 tragedy celebrated Juanita's courage for taking on such a controversial chapter of history and doing it so well. The book would go on to receive national honors. Now, the Mountain Meadows Massacre was published a few months after I was born. My parents had a first edition copy of the book. They never read it. They did not have much of a library in our small home on 200 South here in St. George, but what books they had, including Mountain Meadows Massacre, were located in a small bookcase near the front door. I passed this little bookcase many times, every day. I knew Juanita's book was there, but I also did not read it. Although Massacre occurred just 30 miles from my home, I knew it was a dark stain on southwestern Utah, and that many of the ancestors of family members and friends were involved in the tragedy. When I was 14, our teachers' quorum in the church visited the Meadows, and we were given a presentation on the massacre. Unfortunately, it leaned heavily on themes attempting to justify the perpetrators' actions. It would not be until I returned from my church mission from Germany that I first noticed a recently published book written by Juanita Brooks. It was Uncle Will Tells His Own Story. I picked it up and leisurely read it over the weekend. I was amazed. It was a wonderful account of a local man I had known well. He was a good man, loved by all, who had some remarkable adventures during a lifetime. I had previously viewed him as a pretty average guy. What I thought after reading the book is that everyone has a story, and Juanita helped Will Brook tell his in a most engaging and interesting way. That experience then led me to other of Juanita's books. I forgot to tell you that the Brooks were Democrats. Did I mention that? The Snows were Democrats too. That's why I've always liked them. Now, my father fell under the influence of a Republican woman, so we weren't necessarily raised as Democrats. We were raised as Republicans, but I was proud to come back home when I became an adult. Sorry, I've gotten off track. So that I started reading Juanita's other books. I next read John Doyle Lee, Zealot, Pioneer Builder, Scapegoat, followed by a much smaller book about one of his wives, Emily, who was with him at the ferry, at Lee's Ferry. Finally, I summed up the courage to take on Mountain Meadows Massacre. Needless to say, it's a very impressive and very discouraging read. I was a bit dismayed that the massacre had not unfolded the way that good brother in my ward had described it to me years ago. Juanita's carefully researched and objective analysis was impossible to dispute. Her book correctly defined what happened for the most part and ripped the scab off a wound which had festered in our part of the country for many years. The code of silence and deniability adopted by the perpetrators and even the church for some decades after were laid bare. The blaming of the Paiutes by many, including the church, would stop, and eventually the church would issue a formal apology to the tribe, the Paiute tribe, long after Juanita died. Years later, I would read Levi Peterson's excellent biography of Juanita entitled Juanita Brooks, Mormon Woman Historian. In his opening chapter, he wrote, "She was an affectionate mother, a loyal wife, a respected school teacher, an energetic organizer of church and civil affairs. She had, however, the unusual habit of traveling by night bus to Salt Lake City or Los Angeles. If she was lucky, a bus might be lightly loaded and she could dispose of 2 seats and sleep. But if the bus were crowded, it did not matter so much. It was fortunate she didn't need much sleep because she lived by a harried schedule. She wanted to be a good mother, wife, and community worker, but she also wanted to be a historian," close quote. How she kept this life in balance is a great tribute to her character and hard work. My good friend Carl told me several times the story of coming home one day for supper and asking his mother if she wrote books. Now, he was old enough to know that she did, but he had no idea. It had not dawned on him that she was an author as well as a good mother. There are a number of quotes and stories from her writings which have a special meaning to me, which I'd like to share. They have delighted me over the years, caused me to laugh, and even inspired me to change my own behavior. One of my favorites comes from her teenage years in Bunkerville. She fought in Sunday school with her teacher, an older brother, Uncle Lon, a half-brother to her father, Henry. He was quite a character, and she took issue with his slothful appearance, and especially his fervent testimony of the truthfulness of all stories within the Old Testament, which he took as literal. She would challenge him on these tales from the Bible, and her classmates responded with laughter and irreverence. It was becoming a major disruption, and Uncle Lon finally complained to her father, who pleaded with his daughter, who was, of course, quite headstrong, to be more considerate and forgiving. According to Levi Peterson, he also drew an analogy. Quote, "A cowboy who wants to turn a stampeding herd can ride neither in it nor counter to it. He must ride at the edge. Happy sounds are generally better than cursing." She would quote him as saying, "But there are times when he must maybe swear a little and swing a whip or lariat to round in a stray or turn the leaders. So don't lose yourself and don't ride and desert the herd, the outfit. Ride the edge of the herd and be alert, but know your directions and call out loud and clear. Chances are you won't make any difference, but on the other hand, you just might." I've thought of this story often. It was first shared with me by Carl probably in 1992, and often when I've been faced with a new responsibility or assignment, I've thought of Juanita's story that she heard from her father about riding herd. It has often been of great help. Now, I probably should also point out she cleared up a little bit of a mystery to me when I was growing up. One of the big events that occurred when I was 11 was the church came here to film a movie entitled Windows of Heaven, which is about the revelation that Lorenzo Snow had about tithing. And of course, the first time he gave the sermon was at this pulpit. Now, I had always thought that it was exactly as the movie had portrayed. But in Uncle Will Tells His Own Story, Will was sitting right where the young lady or the person, sorry, my eyes are getting bad, please, I apologize, in the white, right in the middle, right above what, there used to be a very plain clock. Yeah, that's the one. So there was a very, is there many here that remember the clock that was right there? Yeah, there was a clock. That's where Will was sitting right there when Lorenzo Snow gave his talk in the St. George Tabernacle. And he was quite taken back that the movie had portrayed it incorrectly. In fact, he said the movie was rubbish. Now, many of my friends were in the movie, my father was in the movie, my sister and brother and mother were in the movie, and we were greatly proud of this movie here in St. George. But Will cleared the record. He said it was rubbish. That was not how it occurred when President Lorenzo Snow addressed the congregation. So that might be why we never use the movie anymore. In 1928, Juanita took the Union Pacific Flyer across the country to study for a year at Columbia University. Apparently, funding came available for someone from the college to go on sabbatical. That had never occurred before, of course, at Dixie Junior College. A.K. Hafen was the senior, my wife's grandfather was the senior faculty member. Well, he had 10 children at home, so it had been pretty difficult for him to leave for a year of sabbatical. And each person who was questioned down the line had reasons why they couldn't accept the sabbatical until they got to Juanita. And she said, "Don't ask me, I'll be gone in a heartbeat." And she was, and went to New York and obtained a master's degree in English during her time. Living there all alone, her son Ernest was with his grandparents down in Bunkerville. As the train she was on, the Union Pacific Flyer, reached the verdant scenes in the Midwest and East, this girl from Bunkerville marveled that things grew for no reason at all. Now in Bunkerville, you have to literally coax things out of the soil. So this was quite a revelation to her that things really grew for no reason. While studying at BYU, she and her siblings and baby Ernest were living in rented quarters with no indoor plumbing. Her younger sister Charity showed up 2 weeks after the term began. She just arrived home from her mission and she wanted to go to BYU. And she came up to join her siblings. How could we manage, Juanita wrote? Simply by moving over. Ara and I already slept in a double bed with good springs. We just moved over, which placed me in the middle. Does anyone sleep in a double bed anymore? It's pretty small. Not a queen, we're talking smaller than a queen. So 3 of the sisters were in this double bed. But I just love, she said, I love her spirit of making it work, as in this case, simply by moving over. She enjoyed repeating the story of her great-grandmother Mary attending a meeting in Bunkerville with some of the visiting wives of Brigham Young. They came down to establish the Retrenchment Society. They told us how it was the wish of the president that we should do away with all our extravagances in dress and habits. I looked around at the women in attendance. We were all in homespun, which of course was coarse and faded looking because we hadn't learned yet how to set the indigo. And the speaker wore a silk dress with wide bands of velvet ribbon and lace edging. I sat there and listened as long as I could stand it, her grandmother wrote. And then she said, "Which do you want us to retrench from, Sister Young, the bread or the molasses?" It is no secret Juanita Brooks had not the support of the presiding headquarter leadership of the LDS Church in her research and writing of the Mountain Meadows Massacre. She had been denied access to important affidavits which would have been helpful in her research and writing. There was always the possibility that publishing the book would lead to a disciplinary action against Juanita by the church. She worried about that. She knew some church leaders with whom she had met were not happy about the book. Bravely, though, she moved forward. In the preface of her book, she had underscored her strong testimony of the church, but then she wrote, "I feel sure that nothing but the truth can be good enough for the church to which I belong." I've always been inspired by that quote, and it's given me comfort and hope through my own faith journey. And it was particularly helpful when I had the opportunity to serve as historian for the church for 7 years. Clearly, there are many things about the life of Juanita Brooks which are inspiring. Let's return now to the theme of my remarks. How does studying the past affect a better future? Contained in the writings of Juanita Brooks are many life lessons. We learn in the case of Uncle Will tells his own story, we learn every life has worth and how important it is to record your own story, if for no other reason than to leave a record for future generations. In John Doyle Lee, we learn a good life can change forever by making one disastrous mistake. All of the good accomplishments in life can be erased by one bad decision. In Mountain Meadow Massacre, we learn that good people can be quickly led to do horrible deeds, that the capacity to do evil lies in each of us, and that we must be constantly on guard to suppress the propensity to do evil, but instead to strive to do good continually. If that rings like something from out of the Book of Mormon, that's true. And you have to forgive me, for over 20 years, I was a 70, so I wrote a lot of religious talks. And it's kind of hard when you write a talk without some religion in it. So that's paraphrasing a phrase from the Book of Mormon. We also learn the need to make important decisions in council and to not arbitrarily proceed without the consent and advice of others. Also, we learn the need to confront our mistakes and to not deny them or cast blame on others. Brooks's books and articles are full of such lessons. When we read about Dudley Levitt, Emma Lee, Jacob Hamblin, Hosea Stout, George Brooks, Martha Spence Haywood, to me personally, I'm inspired by her life as a person. She stayed when she could have gone to the outside, so to speak. She stayed in the land that she loved dearly. She left a legacy as mother and as important a member of her community, the college, and her church. She raised children who have done important things and who have led responsible lives, and who in turn have raised responsible children of their own. Not everyone has been able to know multiple generations of the Juanita Levitt Brooks family, but I have. I haven't known them all, but I've known many. And that undoubtedly is her greatest legacy. Thank you very much. You want to take any questions?
Thank you so much, Elder Snow, and for everyone for coming. Before we leave, there's going to be an offering from Sister Jenkins, one of the missionaries of the